Welcome to Stories of the Night Sky. Tonight we're going to take a special look and an in-depth look at what our night sky looks like. And throughout the program I want you to interact with us using chat to either ask questions or to answer the questions we ask. I'm Jim, and I'm going to be accompanied tonight with Bernie and another Jim. We're from Tucson, Arizona. So when you guys go outside and you look up at the night sky, what do you see? Do you see a lot of stars, or do you just see a few stars? So that's the first time I want you to enter something into the chat. You tell me if there's a lot or a few stars that you can see, and then also tell me where you live. Is it near a big city, or is it near a small town, or out in the country? Because believe it or not, all the city lights actually dim out the night sky, so it's harder to see things. So ideally, you want to look at astronomy and look at stuff when you're away from city lights. When astronomers go outside and we look up in the night sky and look at all the stars, we divide those stars up into groups, and we call those groups constellations. And if you were to look in the northern sky, and a lot of you have probably seen this, you'll see the Big Dipper. It's got a curved handle and a bucket on it. The Big Dipper is part of Ursa Major. And Ursa Major is the Big Bear. And if you use the Big Dipper and the two end stars of the bucket of the Big Dipper and you follow those down, you can actually find the North Star. North Star is Polaris, and it's out in the middle, pretty much the middle of nowhere, and it's the end of the handle of the Little Dipper. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're at night, if you want to be able to find north. So that's one of the things that we can use in the night sky. So when you look at stars, what are stars? Well, stars are a lot of gas, and they're very big. Some stars are huge, and the large stars are actually only live maybe millions of years. And that's fairly short in star time. Medium-sized and small stars like our sun can live billions of years, and so they live a long time. And our sun's only about halfway through its age, so it's got a long ways to go yet. So that's kind of interesting about how the big picture works as far as the stars go. When we look at stars and we look in the night sky, we can see lots and lots of stars, and we're going to see lots of objects in the sky. And so tonight we're going to look at a couple of those kinds of things. So what I want to do now is I want to turn it over to Bernie, and he's going to talk a little bit about a stellar nursery. Now, if you remember when you were born, you probably don't remember when you were born, but your parents took you home and they took you into your room. And that room they called a nursery. And that's where you were fed, and that's where you grew up and things like that. Well, stars have the same thing. They have a nursery as well. And we're going to look at one of those tonight.
Hi, my name's Bernie, and I'm going to be talking about constellations tonight, and also one constellation in particular. What exactly are constellations? Well, constellations are familiar patterns in the sky that are things that we're familiar with, like people or animals or tools. And those patterns were developed thousands of years ago. Now, why did they do that? Basically because thousands of years ago, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have GPS. They didn't even have calendars. So how did they know when to do things? How did the farmers know when to plant their crops? How did they know when to harvest those crops? How did the hunters know when to hunt and when to store food for winter? If you were a sailor and you were out at sea, how would you know where you were? How would you know which way was north and south and east and west? That was done with the stars, and in particular with constellations, because constellations were something familiar that you could pass down to your children. You could say, this looks like, and show it to them, and then they could remember what it looked like and pass it to their children. And in that way, those functions of sailing or planting or hunting were passed down from generation to generation. Nowadays, we don't really need that anymore. We have calendars and cell phones. But astronomers still use the constellations as a means to divide up the sky into different sections so that they can find things. So if another astronomer says to me, "Did you see that object in Ursa Major last night?" I'll know exactly where in the sky he's talking about. So tonight I'd like to show you a very, very familiar constellation. And if you look over here on this screen, you'll see one of the most familiar constellations in the winter sky. Can you guess what constellation this is? If you can, or if you want to guess which one it is, type that into your chat line, and let's see how many of you can get that right. As I said, this is a very familiar one that's in the winter sky, and it kind of looks like a stick man, doesn't it? Here he's got two legs, a left leg and a right leg. He's got a left shoulder and a right shoulder. He's kind of got a head up here. He's got an arm that's raised up into the sky, and some people kind of envision that arm holding a club. And his other arm is extended, and it looks like it's maybe holding either a bow or maybe a shield. And across his midsection, there's 3 stars that go across. That's his belt. And down below, although it's not outlined in blue, but down below, there's also 3 little stars, or what look like stars, in a row. And that is called his sword. So the ancient Greeks named this constellation, and they felt that it looked like a mighty great hunter up in the sky. Now, this constellation has some very interesting surprises to it, but you need a telescope to see them. One of them is this star in the upper left corner. This star right here is called Betelgeuse. And Betelgeuse is a super red giant star. It's an enormous star. If you took our sun away and put Betelgeuse in its place, it would be all the way out to the orbit of Mars. And Mercury and Venus and Earth would be gone. They'd be dissolved into the interior of that star. That's how big that star is. Now, you may have heard on the news recently, there's been some talk about Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse, in the last few months, has dimmed way down. It's not as bright as it used to be. And of course, the news media has published papers saying, oh, maybe it's going to explode pretty soon. It is a star that will probably go supernova sometime in the near future. So that's been in the news recently. But you have to be a little careful about what they say is near future. The near future in astronomical terms means anytime from now to 100,000 years from now. So don't wait up for it. It's not worth staying up all night. It's not probably going to happen. Maybe not even in our lifetimes. Now, another surprise that this constellation has for us is right there in that sword, in the middle, what looks like a middle star, right there in the sword of this constellation. And by the way, did you guess what constellation this is? Let me show you what that middle star looks like when we look through it in a telescope. Here is what that central star actually looks like in a telescope. This is called a nebula. And this particular nebula is called M42. It's also known as the Great Nebula of Orion. This is an enormous gas cloud out in space. And you'll notice that gas cloud has a lot of red color to it. And inside that gas cloud are individual stars as well. Now, what do you think happens inside that gas cloud? If you have an idea what happens in that gas cloud, type that into your chat and we'll see how many of you get that right. All that red that you see in this gas cloud is hydrogen. It's called ionized hydrogen. And that hydrogen is a gas that's being ionized by all the stars that are in that cloud. That cloud is actually visible if you have a telescope or a good pair of binoculars. So if you do and you want to see this, maybe not that large, but you can definitely make it out in a telescope or a pair of binoculars. Go out at night just after sundown and look in the west and you'll see the constellation of Orion. Look for the central star in the sword where I showed it to you earlier. Now, that gas cloud, you'll notice there's kind of swirls in that gas cloud. Sometimes those swirls start to, under the right conditions, start to condense down. And they attract more gas. And that gas attracts more gas. And it builds up bigger and bigger and bigger and hotter, and it's gravity takes over and it starts attracting dust and everything else around it like a great big vacuum cleaner. And it keeps on growing and getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it reaches a critical temperature and bam, a new star is born. So many of these stars that you see here, especially the ones in the middle, are brand new stars that have just been born. These are only a couple 100,000 to 1 million years old, which sounds really, really old, but in astronomical terms, that just happened yesterday because most stars are billions of years old. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jim, and he's going to talk about some objects that are much closer to us than this nebula. Thank you for your time.
All right, so Bernie kind of talked about where stars are born. Now we're going to bring it a lot closer to home. So I want you to take a look at the object that's on the screen right now. Take a real hard look at it and type into the chat what you think it is. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But while you're doing that, then I'm going to talk a little bit about our solar system. So if you think of our solar system as a family, and the sun's in the center, and so it's kind of like mom or dad. Sun's huge. You can fit almost 1 million Earths inside the sun. And if you think about it, the light from the sun, it takes 8 minutes from the light to get from the sun to your eyeballs at the speed of light. So the sun's very, very far away, and it's big. And it's the center of our solar system. The rest of the solar system, the planets are kind of split up between the 4 inner planets and the 4 outer planets. The inner planets, the closest to the sun is Mercury, and there's not much going on Mercury. It's pretty hot, and it's pretty barren. The next one out is Venus. Venus is shrouded in clouds, and so as the light penetrates the clouds in Venus, the heat can't escape. So Venus, even though it's further away from the sun, is actually hotter than Mercury. And then the next one out is our beautiful planet Earth. So we know life is on Earth, and everything we need for life is right here on Earth. And we have a wonderful moon that the other Jim's going to talk about here in just a little bit. And then after Earth, the fourth planet out is Mars. Now for the kids listening, probably in your lifetime, you're going to have the opportunity to travel to the moon or to Mars and actually live on either one of those. So you're going to have an amazing opportunity to experience our solar system up close and personal. Now the other four planets in our solar system are the four outer planets. They're the big ones. The first one there is Jupiter. Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system. You can put 1,300 Earths inside of the planet Jupiter. And it's got 79 moons. So it's got a lot of moons. We've only got one, but it's got 79. The next planet out from Jupiter is Saturn. Saturn's got some gorgeous rings going around Saturn made out of rock and ice. If you ever get a chance to look at either Jupiter or Saturn through a telescope, definitely take it because they are awesome inside in a telescope. And then the last two planets that in the outer part of the solar system are what we call ice giants because out there the sun doesn't have much heat and it's very, very, very cold. And that is Uranus and Neptune. All right, so now let's come back into what was on the screen. So if you look at the screen again and you look at that picture, it kind of looks like a nice crescent, and a lot of you maybe thought that was the moon. But if you look closely at it, most of the time in the moon you can see some dark areas and some light areas, and you can see a lot of clarity. This image looks a little blurry, and that's because it's not the moon, it's the planet Venus. Venus, like I said earlier, is enshrouded in clouds. So why does it look like the moon? Well, both Mercury, Venus, and the moon all have different phases. They go through phases. So it all depends on where they are in their orbit, where the Earth is, and where the sun is. To which side of the planet, or in the moon's case, the moon is lit up. So sometimes you have a small crescent. Sometimes it's fully lit and it's all full. Sometimes, like in the case of the moon, if it's in between us and the sun, then it's a new moon and we can't see it at all because the backside's lit. Now, Venus is kind of a difficult planet. Like I said earlier, Venus is very, very hot and not a fun place to live. Early in Venus history, it got hit by probably a very large planet when the planets were just forming. And it got hit so hard that it slowed the spin down so much that it actually started spinning backwards. And so what's happening is if you were to be able to live on Venus, the sun would actually rise in the west and set in the east, just the opposite of what it does here on Earth. And Venus spins so slowly that one day on Venus is 243 Earth days long. So you've got about 120-day daytime and 120-day nighttime. So the sun's barely going to move in the night sky because it spins so slowly. And so that's the planet Venus. And Venus right now is currently in the evening sky, but it's about ready to go in between the sun and the Earth. And then it'll disappear in the evening and it'll come out and appear in the morning. So that's what the object was that was on the screen. So now I want to bring you even closer to home, and we're going to have Jim talk a little bit about the moon.
Hi, I'm the other Jim, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the moon and how we can see different features on it and what they might mean. Humanity has always been called with a need to understand what the moon is, and different cultures have different ways of explaining how it came about. The Navajo, for example, thought that when they first were pulled by their creator out onto the surface of the earth from below the earth, that it was all dark and they were afraid and they needed light. So they found a piece of a special kind of rock called mica, and they polished it until it was a big disc, a big white disc. And a wise elder of the tribe volunteered to carry it into the sky so that it would light people's way. Just so he could control it better. They actually attached 12 eagle tail feathers onto the
disk of mica so that it could be easier for him to steer it. So he jumped up into the sky towards the east, but he found out that he was a little bit too old to control it, and he couldn't get it pointed the right way. So the east wind tried to help. The east wind blew on him to try to move him along, to help him have a moving moon in the sky. Unfortunately, it caused the feathers to block his face, and he got lost up in the sky. And ever since then, he's been turning around, looking, trying to find his way. So that's why when we look up at the moon, we see a different lighting on the moon as the wise man tries to find his way. The Navajo thought that the dark spots we see on the moon was the shadow of the feathers of the eagle that they had put on the moon to help guide it. But we really know differently from that. We know that around 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth started to be formed. And it was more like hot oatmeal bubbling when all the rocks came together and banged together to make the object that we now call the Earth. At around the 4 billion years point, it was more like hot pudding with a crust on it, but it was still pretty hot. When another wild planet that was swinging around the sky came up and hit the Earth very hard enough to knock part of the outer layer of the Earth off, and for this new planet, Theia, to be absorbed by the former Earth. That debris that it threw out only took about a year to form a new object in the sky, the Earth, that would be circling us. So scientifically, we know that about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth started to form, and by 4 billion years ago, it was pretty much a formed solid object with a solid crust, but a molten inside, and it got hit by another one of the new forming planets called Theia. Theia was about the size of Mars, so it was a pretty strong hit, and it sent that debris out into space, and within about a year it formed into what we now call the moon. It started to cool off. It was a hot, molten, like a cooling pudding kind of ball at the same time, circling the Earth. At that time, the solar system started to get very irregular in its behavior, and a lot of rocky bodies, we called them asteroids and meteoroids and meteors, started coming in to the inner solar system. And when it did that, that was called the Late Heavy Bombardment, 3.5 billion years ago. And that hit the moon and the Earth, which only had thin crust, so it was molten underneath it. And so that flowed out every place it hit, and it left these lakes of molten rock. Now, about that time, the Greeks were when the Greeks later would look up at the moon, they thought that was water in those impact points, and so they called them Maria. Singular of that is mare. That meant seas. They thought those were water seas up there when they saw it. So that's how the Earth and moon got bombarded about 3.5 billion years ago, and then everything calmed down. Well, about 1 billion years ago, it all started getting active again. More objects came into the inner solar system. But this time, when they hit the moon, they only left dry craters, sometimes called ray craters because they spread the dirt or the lunar material out over the moon. And so when they did so, that left two different kinds of objects on the moon. And I'll start pointing at those objects right now. The first kind are the Maria. So the objects on the features on the surface of the moon are of two types. One are either dry craters or the filled Maria with that used to have molten rock. Maria are the dark areas that are up here in the upper part of the moon. If I look at the lower part of the moon, I see all the dry craters, all the craters that got hit. It turns out the Earth got hit just about as much, but we had weather, and the weather we had was able to smooth out all the defects except for more recent craters. So when that happened to the near side of the moon, it turns out that on the far side of the moon, it looked like a golf ball. Those Maria didn't appear except for one. And there was a curiosity as why this happened. And it turns out that's the way the debris formed the moon. There were actually two collections or clouds of debris. And the one that formed on the outer part of the moon was actually on what's the backside. It's actually 33 miles thicker than the surface on the front side. So that the extra 33 miles stopped all the early hits that the moon took on that side from leaking lava out, with the exception of one crater. The moon ended up being 1/4 the size of the Earth. Now that is huge as far as moons and satellites are to their home planet. Because it's so big, it's got a tremendous amount of gravity compared to what naturally would occur with smaller rocks. That gravity causes a bulge on the Earth as the moon goes around. But the Earth rotates faster. So what happens is that bulge gets in front of the moon, and the moon actually starts to slow the Earth down. It slows it down not very much, about 1.5 seconds every 100,000 years. But since it was formed about 4 billion years ago, that means that the day at the time it was formed was only 6 hours long. Now it's 3 hours and 56 minutes long because of that drag. Meanwhile, the Earth is pulling the moon along, and it's speeding it up. And because of speeding up the moon is actually starting to drift out. So when it was formed, it filled up about 2/3 of the night sky. Now it's just 1/2 degree in size in the sky. Luckily, just about the size of the sun, and often we can get eclipses where its body and the sun's body are about the same size, so that when the moon passes between the sun and the Earth, we get a solar eclipse. I'm going to point out a couple of features on the moon that are kind of nice right around first quarter to look at. The first thing I'll look at is craters, and I'll start to name them, or maria, and I'll start to name them. On the top is the Sea of Serenity, where my finger is pointing. That's called the Sea of Serenity because when the Greeks named these, they tried to name them off of serious things like emotions or events. The next crater down is the Sea of Tranquility. Now you might have heard of the Sea of Tranquility because that's where Apollo 11, the first manned landing on the moon, happened. And I'll point to where Apollo 11 landed. Right near that bump at the bottom of that crater. Right about there. The next crater down is the Sea of Fertility. And right next to the Sea of Fertility is the Sea of Nectar. And very far out is the Sea of Crises, with a little bit of lava connecting it back to the rest of the craters. As a result, it makes a shape, and in some cultures, that's called the lunar poodle, because it looks like a standard poodle all cut for a show. I'd like to finish talking about the moon by a different kind of story told by a different people, the Yaqui Indians, the Native American tribe in southern Arizona and mostly northern Mexico. What the Yaqui thought was that the sun and the moon existed before the Earth came along. They created the Earth, and the sun wanted the moon to be his girlfriend, but she didn't care about it. But he pestered her so much that she said, okay, if you get me the perfect gift that fits me just perfectly, then I'll be your girlfriend. So the sun runs away and finds the best tailor he can find to make her the perfect dress. He comes back a few days later, it doesn't fit. He thought he had perfect measurements. She says, nope, no good. So he throws it away, goes find the tailor again with new measurements, comes back in a few days, and it doesn't fit again. And she says, still not right, and he throws that one away. That has been going along since the creation of the Earth. That battle, or that courtship of the sun, of the moon. And it's kind of interesting that he hasn't figured out one trick. What do you think he could do to get a dress that fits? You can try to put it in on the chat and say what trick could he do to have a dress that fits, but I'll give you a hint. If he kept 27 dresses in a row, one of them would fit. And that is how our moon came to be.
So I hope you enjoyed our stories of the night sky. No matter where you live, try to seek out and find one of your local astronomy clubs, because a lot of times they offer free star parties, and it's an opportunity for you to look at stuff through a telescope. And if you're really interested in astronomy, maybe even join their club, because then you can actually use some of their equipment and be able to look at stuff for yourself. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll keep looking up in clear skies.